Okay guys, so as I mentioned before, I'm going to read through the whole article. Now we're going to dig through each of the lines and see what kind of vocabulary we find. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about those transition words we mentioned. So to get started, I'll just show you some of the vocabulary list I've made from this article. The first thing that we want to look at is the mummification and how biologists explain this. And then finally, the climate change, right? So let's take a look here. So the first section really talks about archaeology. An archaeologist, a person who studies human history by analysis of artifacts and other physical remains. And those artifacts are made by human beings, typically cultural or historical interest. And mummies are a type of artifact, right? A mummy is a body that's been preserved, something that we do to keep that body or that item safe from harm or injury. And we talked a little bit about bacteria, about climate change and warmth, and how mummification is something that humans do to preserve the bodies of their loved ones or the people in their community. So there's two types of mummification, intentional and natural. Humans do this mummification. They mummify their people in their community to basically as a ceremonial practice, a burial practice in which they remove the organs of the body, pack it in salt until it dries, and then wrap it in cloths. This is different from the natural mummification. Sometimes we find mummies as a result of cold, like we find in glacier, like we'll find dinosaurs and things like that, of acid, as can be found in a bog, or of dryness, as we're talking about in this article in particular, like in the desert, Arica, Chile. The archaeologists will find these burial mounds or these places or sites where mummies are, and these burial mounds are small raised piles of soil or stones or sites in which the grave is found, or the burial where the body is stored. And they dig them up. That's a verb, to dig up, to uncover something from the ground or to uncover something in general. Okay, so we're going to go back to the article and take a look at that first half. So we talked a little bit about mummies. They created the oldest known mummies on Earth, which was a surprise to me. Chinchorro created the oldest mummies, even older than Egyptians. And mummies, again, are the bodies that they find, the archaeologists find, that have been preserved. And that's either naturally or intentional, as we just discussed. And this one happens to be intentional. And we compare the two, the Egyptians with the Chinchorro, when we talk about the Chinchorro mummifying their dead. And the Egyptians considered only kings and other important citizens worthy of mummification, while the Chinchorros mummified everyone, which is pretty exciting and interesting to find out. Regardless of their age or status, they mummified everyone. So we see that mummy, mummification, and mummify. So those are three different forms of that word. And they compare it a lot here in this section of the article. The other section, we talk a little bit about burial, decay, and what it looks like when the mummification goes kind of in a bad way. So it says they're not in great shape. So we can see how the mummies are not doing well. We see here, since 1917, hundreds of mummies have been dug up and more are uncovered all the time, but they're dealing with this problem of decay. So the purpose of mummification is to preserve them. However, now with climate change, we're seeing these mummies are decaying. They are not being preserved. They are falling apart. Organic matter rots or decomposes. through the action of bacteria and fungi. And we can see here, biologists are the ones that are finding this out. So someone who studies life in living organisms or dying organisms, they look at how tissue is either decaying or coming to life. And tissue is what animals and plants are made of. And they're consisted of specialized cells and their products. And decaying is when these cells or these cells of the animals or plants are deteriorating. So the article discusses quite a bit about how indoors they seem to be doing okay. The mummies are okay. They're staying preserved. But outdoors, they are already damaged. They're being eaten up by bacteria. And that is because the changing climate is affecting that, right? The changing climate was, again, abnormal changes to normally consistent climates. Like the desert is usually super dry, but lately more rain is not always good, as we're seeing in the Arica, Chile region. The global climate change is causing an effect on how these preserved mummies are becoming more decayed. So global climate change is slightly different than regular climate change. Climate change is going to be in a particular region. Global climate change is going to affect the entire world. So the individual climate changes all over the world create an overall impact with global changes. And, as we mentioned earlier, for these reasons, the researchers started to dig into or uncover the causes for these changes in the mummies, and they are attributing it mostly to increased temperatures, increased moisture or precipitation. And we can look at that as being a more humid environment, which is marked by a relatively high level of water vapor in the atmosphere or in the air. And the organisms or the bacteria, they tend to enjoy this because they can get some nutrients from these mummies. So bacteria are those single-cell organisms. They thrive in diverse environments like mummy skin, which is gross, but they do enjoy that meal that they're getting from them and those nutrients that help them keep alive. So they're living off those preserved mummies and actually degrading them or making them deteriorate. The problem, the biggest problem, is that it's not just mummies that are affected. So there are many cultural artifacts that are at risk from the changing climate, and those are preserved, hopefully, with World Heritage Sites like the UN or the United Nations has created. And those are protected natural or man-made areas or structures recognized as being international importance or deserving special protection. So we can kind of see how all this fits together in those last couple of paragraphs. The buildings that were in India, as they discussed, were getting too much rain and were falling apart. The burial mounds in Russia, they are melting because it's hot, so they are not used to that warm weather, and they're melting, and therefore the artifacts are losing their preservation as well. And finally, the other victims, future victims, might be the marble statues, as seen in Greece or Rome. And marble, again, is a type of soft stone used in sculptures. So when we look at all these things, we can see the transition words that the author uses to kind of help us understand how all this stuff ties together. So So let's go back and check out the transition words and what they are, now that we have some vocabulary to help us understand these concepts. So transition words are essential. They not only connect ideas, but they introduce a certain shift, contrast, or opposition, emphasize something, or they agree with something. It might be a result or a conclusion. And we use these to help us kind of signpost or give us directions while we're reading. So let's take a look here, just another picture for you. They're usually using one clause and another clause, one sentence and another sentence, or one group of sentences and the next group of sentences. So here we've got two ideas. Transition directly tells the reader the relationship between these. Are they comparing them, contrasting them? Are they adding on to the last idea? Are they starting a new idea? However that works. They are going to explain it here. So let's take a look at this. Oops. Transition words and phrases. We have agreement, addition, similarity. You'll see these examples here. Moreover, in addition to, also, those are going to be to help you add on or express agreement with the last idea. Opposition, contradiction, like we talked about, Egyptian versus the different types of burial practices and how they are different from each other. So we can see things like while, or despite, although, even so, etc. Cause or condition. After we've learned all this information, this caused us to investigate further, right? And finally, support, emphasis, as a result, and a conclusion, right? To sum up, or so, in brief, in essence. So we'll take a look. Let's see if we can find some of those here. We've got moreover. Let's go back to the beginning here. Right. So, in addition to the UN, the U.S. agency is also concerned about how climate change can affect cultural sites. So we're saying the UN is talking about these things here, and in addition to that, the U.S. is also adding on to that concept. In other words, so we're kind of wrapping up or summarizing that concept there, restating the previous ideas, that these particular artifacts are ill-suited or not ideal for these kinds of climates with a lot of rain. We have other examples going back to compare, contrast. Looking at while. For example, we saw while the mummies indoors at the museum have been slow to decay, the mummies outdoors are being discovered already damaged. So they're comparing previous idea, mummies indoors, to the following idea, the next idea, mummies outdoors. And we're comparing those using the word while. Right. Going back even further, we're looking at the comparison of mummification in Chinchorro versus Egyptian. So we have the Egyptians are using that while the Egyptians, idea 1, and idea 2, the Chinchorro mummified everyone. The Egyptians only used the important citizens versus the Chinchorro. Okay, what I'd like you to do is go back through and find more examples of transition words. You can use the website And if you have any more questions, you can follow along with the directions